Hey, my friends.
Sterling stood in the center of the living room, holding a glass of my 12-year-old scotch with a grip that lacked any respect for its history. He looked at me, then at Cordelia, with the kind of smug confidence only a man who has never bled for a paycheck can possess. "It's time to face reality, Silas," he said, his voice flat and devoid of the gratitude he had performed for years. "Get out of here. This is our house now, and we need our space without you hovering over us." He spoke as if he had laid the bricks himself, forgetting whose signature was on the mortgage and the monthly utility bills. I didn't flinch, and I didn't look at Cordelia, because I already knew the steel that was settling in her eyes. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing, but for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. Sterling mistook my stillness for confusion, perhaps thinking my 60 years had finally caught up to my reflexes. He didn't understand that when a man has seen as much as I have, he doesn't waste energy on useless shouting. I've learned that the loudest person in the room is usually the one with the least amount of real power. He had the noise, but I held the leash, and he was about to find out how short it actually was. "We'll be gone by sunset," I said quietly, the words feeling like a slow-acting poison I was happy to administer. He grinned, satisfied that he had won a battle I hadn't even started fighting yet. As we walked to the car, I felt a strange sense of liberation, the kind you feel right before you take down a structure that's beyond repair. The keys felt heavy in my pocket, but the weight of the financial support I was about to withdraw felt much heavier. The engine turned over with a low growl, matching the calculated rhythm of the plan already forming in my mind. Sterling watched us from the porch, unaware that his borrowed world was about to go dark. We pulled into a roadside motel that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated comfort, a place where the air smelled of stale peppermint and the kind of lost ambitions people leave behind in drawers. I sat in the driver's seat for a full minute, my hands still gripping the steering wheel with a precision that had nothing to do with fatigue and everything to do with the controlled restraint of a man waiting for his heart rate to match his logic. Cordelia was already checking her phone, her face as unreadable as a closed ledger, while I realized I had just tried to exit the vehicle with my seatbelt still firmly buckled. It was a clumsy, undignified moment, the kind of domestic failure that usually makes me laugh, but in this heavy silence, it felt like a minor glitch in a very large, very dangerous machine. I untangled myself with a dry, internal smirk, thinking how Sterling would have loved to see the invincible Silas momentarily defeated by a simple piece of reinforced nylon webbing. The anxiety hummed in the background, not as a fear of the unknown, but as a sharp awareness of the sheer audacity of a man who thinks he can inherit a kingdom while the king is still very much breathing. I've always believed that the most dangerous part of a storm isn't the howling wind, but the sudden, heavy drop in pressure that precedes the destruction. We had spent 40 years building a fortress of security for our daughter, Serafina, only to realize she'd unlocked the gates for a parasite who mistook our kindness for a weakness of the mind. I opened my laptop on the scarred wooden desk of the motel room, the blue light reflecting off my glasses and illuminating a life lived with careful calculation and zero apologies. My finger hovered over the bank's portal, specifically the tab labeled Automated Mortgage and Utility Disbursements that have been fueling Sterling's lifestyle for 3 years. It's a profound and chilling thing to realize that you can dismantle someone's entire reality with nothing more than a single, quiet click of a mouse. I didn't feel the slightest tremor of regret, only the cold, refreshing clarity of a man who is finally correcting a long-standing and expensive accounting error. The motel room was dim and smelled of industrial cleaner, but my vision had never been sharper as I stared at the digital confirmation of the payment cancellations. I leaned back in the creaky chair, my mind already 3 moves ahead, wondering how many days it would take for the golden boy to realize the tap had run dry. I caught my reflection in the dark television screen and realized I was smiling. Not a happy smile, but the one a hunter wears when the trap finally clicks shut. The first notification of a failed transaction would hit Sterling's phone before his morning coffee was even brewed, and I found myself checking my watch as if I could command the sun to rise faster. I wondered if he had enough sense to buy candles, or if he'd be forced to sit in the dark and finally think about the bridge he'd just turned into ash. In 40 years of business, I've learned that debt isn't just about money. It's about the weight of expectations. Most people think they are owed the world because they simply exist, but the world has a very short memory for those who don't contribute. I've seen empires crumble because a single pillar was removed, and I was about to remove the entire foundation. This morning, however, my primary adversary was the motel's coffee machine, a device with more confusing buttons than a luxury jet. I pressed what I assumed was start, only to be rewarded with a violent hiss and a spray of brown water that narrowly missed my favorite silk tie. Cordelia didn't even look up from her news feed, but the slight twitch at the corner of her mouth told me she was thoroughly enjoying my temporary defeat by a plastic kitchen appliance. I wiped the counter with slow, deliberate strokes, refusing to let a malfunctioning pod brewer shake the composure I had spent decades perfecting. The real injustice of the situation wasn't the spray of lukewarm coffee, but the fact that Sterling truly believed he had the intellect to replace me. My phone began to vibrate on the bedside table, a frantic, rhythmic buzzing that signaled the first wave of digital reality hitting his bank account. I watched it move across the surface like a panicked insect, counting the seconds until it fell silent, only for it to start again almost immediately. Serafina sent a text message 5 minutes later, a masterpiece of emotional manipulation that mentioned family bonds and the sanctity of a home. It was the same script she used whenever she overextended her credit at a gallery opening. But this time, the theater was empty. I didn't reply, choosing instead to let the silence do the heavy lifting while I finally managed to coax a single, bitter cup of caffeine from the machine. I saw his car pull into the gravel lot of the motel, the tires kicking up dust like a man who had finally realized his safety net was made of smoke. He didn't come to apologize. He came because the lights in his stolen house had finally flickered and died. Sterling exited his vehicle with the kind of performative aggression that usually hides a profound lack of actual options. I watched him through the motel window, the glass vibrating slightly as he slammed his car door, a car I knew was currently 4 days away from its next lease payment. I reached for my blazer, attempting to slide into it with my usual practiced grace, only to realize I had somehow threaded my arm through the wrong opening entirely. I stood there for a moment, momentarily entangled in my own tailoring, and thought to myself that the dignity of age is often just a very well-executed recovery from a minor disaster. I didn't rush. I simply corrected the error with the patient precision of a man who knows that being fast is never as important as being right. When I finally stepped out onto the gravel, the air was sharp, and Sterling looked like he was vibrating at a frequency that might cause him to spontaneously combust. The bank called. "Silas, what the hell is going on with the account?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the cheap siding of the motel. I didn't answer right away, allowing the sound of a passing truck to fill the gap, letting him simmer in his own rising panic. "You told us to leave, Sterling," I said finally, my tone so calm it was almost surgical. "I assumed that meant you were finally ready to handle the weight of your own roof without my hands under it." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, looking like a fish that had suddenly found itself on the wrong side of the water. It is a peculiar joy to watch someone realize that the floor they were standing on was actually just a rug I've been holding for 3 years. I've noticed that people who scream about their independence are usually the ones most terrified of actually having it. He looked at me, then at the modest motel door, and I could see him trying to find a way to make this my fault without admitting he was broke. "This isn't a game, Silas," he hissed, though the lack of volume suggested he was already losing his nerve. He took a step toward me, but stopped when he saw Cordelia watching from the window, her silhouette as still and ominous as a statue in a graveyard. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the undeniable stench of a man whose bluff had been called far too early. Sterling's face was turning a shade of red that reminded me of a cheap steak left too long on the grill. He began pacing the gravel, his expensive Italian loafers crunching loudly, a sound that screamed of a man who had never actually worked on his feet. I reached for my sunglasses to punctuate my silence, but in my attempt to look effortless, I managed to poke myself directly in the eye with the frame. I didn't flinch or hiss. I simply held the position, waiting for the stinging to subside, while Sterling ranted about legal obligations and family trust. It was a ridiculous moment, a 60-year-old man standing in a dusty parking lot with one watering eye, yet I felt more in control than he ever would. The power is out, Silas, and the water company says the account has been closed. He spat, his voice cracking with the indignity of having to ask for help. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the hollow shell of a man who thought prestige was something you could inherit rather than earn. I've noticed that when people lose their luxuries, they lose their personality along with them. Without my money, Sterling was just a loud noise in a designer suit. I leaned against the rusted railing of the motel balcony, feeling the cold iron through my sleeve, a stark contrast to the heated luxury he was so desperate to reclaim. You wanted the house, Sterling, so you have the house. Walls, roof, and all the darkness that comes with it when you don't pay the bill, I said. His humiliation was palpable, a thick, sour cloud that seemed to shrink him right there in the afternoon sun. I didn't feel pity, because pity is reserved for those who try and fail, not for those who steal and get caught. He looked at his phone, likely checking his balance for the 10th time, hoping for a miracle that I had personally deleted. I turned my back on him to return to the room, my movements slow and deliberate, the ultimate insult to his frantic energy. He reached for my arm as I turned the handle, a desperate move that broke the one rule I had silently established. I stopped, and the air around us seemed to freeze into a jagged edge of pure, unfiltered consequence. I didn't pull away immediately, because doing so would have given him the satisfaction of knowing he could provoke a physical reaction. Instead, I looked down at his hand on my sleeve with the same detached curiosity I'd have for a smudge of grease on a white shirt. My own heart was a steady, rhythmic hammer, not out of fear, but out of the sheer, icy focus that comes when a man finally decides to stop being a benefactor and starts being a consequence. I had intended to say something profound and crushing, but I realized I was still holding the motel's complimentary breakfast muffin, which was as hard as a hockey puck and twice as industrial. I set the rock-hard pastry on the railing with a precision that bordered on the absurd, a small act of domestic order in the middle of a family collapse. Sterling's eyes were wild, searching mine for a flicker of the old Silas, the one who would sigh, reach for his checkbook, and fix everything with a stroke of a pen. He didn't find him. That version of me had died the moment he told us to pack our bags from a house I had bled for. I've spent my life navigating boardrooms and building a legacy, yet I couldn't see the rot growing in my own living room. It's a bitter irony that we spend our prime years shielding our children from the wind, only to realize we've raised people who don't know how to stand up when the breeze finally blows. Sterling, let go of my arm before you mistake my patience for a lack of options, I said, my voice low and vibrating with a frequency that made him finally recoil. He looked at me as if I were a stranger, and in that moment, I suppose I was. I felt the final tether snap, the one that still held a shred of hope for a reconciliation or an apology. There is a specific kind of clarity that comes with total disappointment. It's cold, it's quiet, and it's remarkably efficient. I walked back into the room and locked the door, not to hide, but to signal that the period of negotiation was officially over. I heard him shouting my name outside, but I was already looking at the list of assets I intended to liquidate by morning. The house was just the beginning. I was about to show him what happens when the bank truly closes its doors. The silence in the room was heavier than the shouting outside, a dense, pressurized atmosphere that felt like the cabin of a plane before a long descent. I sat on the edge of the bed, reaching for a small bag of pretzels I bought at the gas station, only to have the plastic explode with a sharp pop that sent salted knots flying across the carpet. I stared at one solitary pretzel resting on my shoe, thinking that even after 60 years of navigating international trade agreements, a bag of snacks could still outsmart me. I didn't curse. I simply brushed the salt from my trousers, noting that life often hands you a mess just as you're trying to look your most formidable. Sterling's muffled threats through the door were becoming a background noise, like a television left on in an empty room, losing its power to irritate. I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand, its red numbers pulsing in the dim light, counting down the minutes until the grace period for the house insurance expired. I've always known that a man's character is built in the seconds after he realizes he's lost everything, and Sterling was currently failing his audition for adulthood. There is a specific kind of coldness that settles in your marrow when you realize your own flesh and blood has become a stranger, someone who views you only as a resource to be tapped. I felt no rage, only a profound, crystalline clarity that our time as the silent architects of their comfort had officially ended. I checked my bank balance one last time, seeing the numbers that represented a lifetime of sweat, and felt a strange, detached satisfaction in knowing they were now invisible to him. Cordelia moved from the window, her footsteps silent on the cheap carpet, and for the first time in hours, she looked directly at me. I handed her the phone, my fingers steady, passing the baton of our retaliation into hands that were far less inclined toward mercy than mine. My role as the negotiator was over. The time for the accountant had passed, and the time for the judge had begun. I watched the screen flicker as she took the device, her face illuminated by a glow that promised a very long, very dark night for the man outside. The storm hadn't even reached its peak, and already, the first of his supports was beginning to snap.
I watched Silas set the phone in my palm, his fingers grazing mine with a coolness that told me he had finally stepped out of the way. For 30 years, I have been the one who balanced the books he wrote, noticing the small, jagged edges of character he preferred to ignore in our daughter's choice of a husband. I looked at the floral wallpaper of this motel room, which was so hideous it actually made the betrayal feel more authentic, a perfect backdrop for a family aesthetic that had just collapsed. Silas was trying to look like a stoic statue, but he had a smudge of pretzel salt on his cheek that made him look more like a disgruntled baker than a ruthless patriarch. I didn't tell him. Some things are better left for the privacy of a mirror, and he needed that small, human flaw to keep from turning into ice. Sterling's voice through the door had shifted from a roar to a whine, the sound of a man who had realized his credit card was now just a useless piece of plastic. I've always found that men like Sterling don't actually love houses or cars. They love the insulation those things provide from the consequences of their own mediocrity. I stood up, smoothing my skirt with a slow, rhythmic motion, enjoying the way the fabric felt, solid and real compared to the ghost of a life we were leaving behind. Serafina's name flashed on the screen again, a digital ghost begging for a haunting that I was no longer willing to host. I thought about the silver tea set I'd left on the sideboard in that house, a wedding gift from my grandmother, and wondered if Sterling would try to hawk it before the week was out. It's a strange thing to realize that the person you raised has become a stranger's accomplice in your own dispossession. But I wasn't sad. I was merely calculating the cost of a clean slate, and the price was finally within my budget. I walked to the door, not to open it, but to let Sterling hear the precise, clicking sound of the secondary deadbolt sliding into place. The silence I offered him was far more expensive than any monthly payment he had ever missed. He stopped shouting then, the sudden quiet more terrifying than any argument I could have started. I knew he was looking at the handle, wondering if the woman who used to bake his favorite pies had finally turned into the woman who would watch him starve. Silas was currently engaged in a silent war with the motel's thermostat, a yellowed plastic box that seemed to defy the laws of physics. He was trying to look like a master strategist, but his reading glasses were perched so crookedly on his nose that he looked more like a confused doll than a vengeful king. I watched him tap the screen with a finger that has signed million-dollar contracts, only to have the device switch the language to German for no apparent reason. It was a small, ridiculous failure that reminded me why I've always been the one to handle the delicate details while he handles the broad strokes. I turned my attention back to the laptop, where the real new facts were unfolding in a series of digital PDF statements. It wasn't just the mortgage we were paying. Sterling had opened a secondary line of credit using a forged signature that looked suspiciously like a tired version of Silas's. The audacity of it was almost impressive, a desperate attempt to fund a lifestyle that his actual salary couldn't even provide the gas for. I felt a cold, sharp spike of disappointment, not because he stole, but because he was so clumsy about the execution. A man who can't even forge a signature correctly has no business trying to steal a legacy from people who built it from dust. Silas finally gave up on the heater, which was now blowing Arctic air, and sat down with a sigh that carried 40 years of patience. "It's not just the house, Silas," I said, sliding the screen toward him so he could see the digital evidence of the betrayal. His watering eye, still red from the incident with his sunglasses, narrowed as he scanned the incriminating numbers. We weren't just the bank anymore. We were the investigators, and the crime was far more personal than a simple eviction. Outside, the sound of Sterling's car revving signaled he was leaving, likely to find a lawyer he couldn't possibly afford. I didn't stop him, because the most effective traps are the ones where the prey thinks they are making a clean escape. The email from the bank's fraud department arrived with a chime that sounded remarkably like a bell for the start of a fight. Sterling thought he was running away, but he was actually just accelerating toward the wall we had already built in the dark. The room was freezing now, the German-speaking thermostat having won the first round of its battle against Silas. He was currently trying to use a plastic motel hanger to reset the device, looking less like a titan of industry and more like a man fishing for a lost sock behind a dryer. I didn't intervene, watching him apply the same intense focus to a piece of cheap plastic that he once used to negotiate international steel tariffs was the only entertainment I had. The shift in the air wasn't just the temperature, it was the realization that our daughter, Serafina, hadn't just been a passive observer to Sterling's greed. I looked at the laptop screen again, seeing a transfer from the house account to a private offshore fund, authorized by a secondary password I recognized instantly. It was her childhood nickname, a word once meant for comfort, now used as a key to drain her parents' retirement funds. Memory is a strange companion. It keeps the warmth of a child's hand in yours while the adult version of that same hand reaches for your throat. I've always known that being a mother means holding a shield for someone who might eventually use it as a weapon against you. Silas let out a grunt of triumph as the heater finally roared to life, but his victory was short-lived when the machine began to emit a scent like burning hair. He looked at me, a strand of his own hair standing straight up from the static, and, for a second, the absurdity of our surroundings almost broke the tension. "Cordelia, I think I've fixed it," he said, just as a small puff of black smoke emerged from the vent. I didn't laugh, because the information on the laptop was far more flammable than a motel heater. I closed the screen with a snap that echoed like a gunshot in the cramped room, my mind already pivoting to the counterstrike. We had been playing defense, hoping for a spark of remorse, but the audit showed there was nothing left to save but our own dignity. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in a decade, a contact listed simply as the adjuster. Sterling thought he had locked us out, but he didn't realize I was the one who originally designed the security system he was currently hiding behind. Silas was currently engaged in a desperate, one-sided wrestling match with a smoke alarm that had taken personal offense to the heater's earlier performance. He was standing on a plastic stool that groaned under his weight, using a ballpoint pen to poke at the silence button with the same surgical precision he'd once used to dismantle a hostile takeover bid. It was a ridiculous sight, a man of his stature nearly defeated by a chirping piece of plastic, yet his jaw was set with a level of focus that usually preceded a corporate execution. I didn't help him. I was too busy watching the live security feed from our home, where the locksmiths I hired were currently turning the house into a fortress Sterling couldn't penetrate. He had called my phone 30 times in the last 10 minutes, but I let each call go to voicemail, a digital graveyard for his increasingly frantic excuses. I've always known that the loudest screamers are the first to break when the silence around them becomes absolute and expensive. Serafina sent a message claiming she was confused by the sudden legal freeze on her offshore accounts, but I know that confused is just her preferred synonym for caught. I walked to the edge of the motel balcony, the wind whipping my hair across my face, and looked down at Sterling's car as it idled near the entrance. He looked up at me, his face pale and drained of the hollow arrogance that had fueled his get-out speech just 24 hours ago. I didn't wave, and I didn't shout. I simply held his gaze until he was the one to blink and retreat into the shadows of his own making. Silas finally silenced the alarm and stepped down, his face slightly flushed, but his eyes as sharp as a razor, looking at me with a silent question. I answered with a single, sharp nod, the signal that the liquidation of their comfort was now proceeding on schedule. He put the car in gear, but he didn't drive away. He just sat there, staring at the gates of a world he no longer had the keys to. He was starting to realize that the bridge he'd burned was the only way back to a life he actually wanted, and I had already cleared the ashes. Silas was currently engaged in a very serious, very focused battle with a bag of travel-sized toiletries, his large hands struggling to open a miniature bottle of shampoo with the intensity of a bomb squad technician. "This is a design flaw, Cordelia," he whispered, as the tiny cap finally popped off and shot across the room, disappearing under the bed with a defiant plastic click. I didn't remind him that we had a spare in the suitcase. Watching him maintain his dignity while searching for a 2-ounce bottle of soap was the kind of levity I needed before the final hammer fell. I turned my attention back to the letter on the screen, a legal notice from Sterling's lawyer, threatening to sue us for intentional infliction of emotional distress and illegal eviction. It was a desperate, flailing move, the kind made by a man who knows he has no ground to stand on and is trying to build a ladder out of thin air. The threat wasn't the lawsuit, which was laughable, but the attachment, a video from Serafina, weeping and claiming we were killing her future. I felt a sharp, cold pang in my chest, not of guilt, but of the final, crushing realization that the child I raised was gone, replaced by a ghost that spoke in her voice but moved with Sterling's greed. "They're threatening to take it to the press," I said, my voice as steady as a surgeon's hand despite the weight of the betrayal. Silas stood up, the stray shampoo bottle finally recovered, and his eyes met mine with a clarity that silenced the hum of the heater. "Let them," he replied, his tone devoid of heat, carrying the weight of a man who has nothing left to hide and everything left to win. We were facing the loss of our reputation and the permanent fracture of our family, yet I had never felt more sure of our footing. I deleted the video without watching the end, because I don't negotiate with emotional terrorists, even if I'm the one who gave them their first pair of shoes. I started typing a reply to the lawyer, not with a defense, but with an invitation to the foreclosure auction I had just authorized for the property. The threat of loss is only effective if you still value the thing being taken, and I had realized that a house filled with such rot wasn't a home at all. I heard a heavy thud against the motel door, followed by the sound of Sterling's voice, now stripped of its bravado and trembling with a very real, very physical fear. He wasn't there to fight anymore. He was there because the walls were finally closing in, and he had nowhere else to run. Sterling scratching at the door reminded me of a stray cat we once had, one that only showed affection when the bowl was empty. Inside the room, Silas was attempting to steam the wrinkles out of his dress shirt using the bathroom's power shower, but he had managed to accidentally activate the emergency pull cord instead. He stood there, slightly damp and tangled in a plastic curtain, looking like a soggy but extremely determined statesman who refused to acknowledge the chaos. I handed him a thin motel towel with a silent, dry smirk, thinking that even when the world is ending, Silas will find a way to be elegantly inconvenienced. I turned back to the door, listening to Sterling's voice crack as he promised to make things right if we just signed the bank release. I've heard better performances in high school theater. His desperation lacked the one thing that could have saved him: actual remorse. I reached for my purse and pulled out the physical deed to the lake house, the one property he didn't know we still held in a separate trust. It was the only asset he actually cared about, and I watched through the peephole as he slumped against the frame, a broken man in a $5,000 suit. I realized then that my daughter hadn't married a man. She had married a projection of her own insecurities, and that projection was finally flickering out. I didn't feel the need to scream or cry, because ice doesn't make a sound when it's freezing you out. Silas, now partially dry but still smelling of industrial hotel soap, stood beside me, his presence a silent wall of support that didn't need words. I didn't open the door. I simply slid a single, notarized piece of paper under it, the notice that all his personal belongings had been moved to a storage unit on the edge of town. The turning point wasn't a loud explosion, but the quiet, rhythmic sound of a man realizing he was officially a guest in a life he thought he owned. I heard the paper rustle as he picked it up, a small sound that signaled the final collapse of his carefully constructed lie. The cold air in the hallway felt like a vacuum, sucking the last of his excuses into the dark. The sun rose over the motel parking lot, casting a harsh, honest light on Sterling's empty car. Silas was currently engaged in a silent, high stakes battle with his carry on suitcase, trying to convince a week's worth of pride and 3 pairs of socks to fit into a space designed for two. He looked like a man trying to solve a complex puzzle in the dark, and when the zipper finally jammed, he just stared at it with a dry, knowing smirk that said, "I've faced worse than nylon." I didn't offer to help. Some victories, however small and domestic, are necessary for a man's soul after he's had to dismantle his own family. I checked my inbox one last time, seeing the final confirmation that our assets were moved to a trust they couldn't even name, let alone touch. The house was gone to the bank, but the home, the real one, built on mutual respect and shared history, was sitting right here in this cramped room. Sterling had sent one final email, a long, rambling confession of debts and bad investments, but I deleted it without reading past the first paragraph. I've learned that when people say I'm sorry, they usually mean I'm sorry I got caught and I didn't have any more room in my life for translation. We walked out of that motel with our heads held high, not because we had won a fight, but because we had finally stopped participating in one. I watched Silas adjust his coat, his posture as straight as a ledger line, the salt smudge finally gone from his face. He looked at the horizon, not with the exhaustion of an old man, but with the quiet anticipation of a sailor who has finally cleared the rocks. We didn't need the silver tea set or the sprawling garden to define who we were. We just needed the ground beneath our feet and the clarity of a clean break. As we drove past the old house, I didn't even turn my head because looking back is for people who aren't sure where they're going. We weren't broken. We were tempered, like steel that has finally cooled after the furnace of a long, expensive mistake. The road ahead was wide, quiet, and entirely ours.